In 2014, Detective Chad Rogers was assigned the Goldstrand and Adank cold case. The cold case team, comprising Detective West, retired Eugene police officer Chuck Tilby, and retired state and federal prosecutor Kirk Engdahl, was still working it, and believed, based on the callousness of the double shooting, that it was likely Lliana and Eric's killer was, if not a serial killer, at least someone who had killed before. Then, a Santa Barbara County detective tipped the Lane County cold case unit to Thor Christensen. Thor Nis Christensen, born in Denmark, was convicted as a serial killer in Southern California in 1980. Christensen had killed 3 so-called co-eds from the Isla Vista area. The first was Jacqueline Rook, age 21, whom he abducted from a bus stop in Goleta, California, on December 6, 1976. His next victim was Mary Saris, who disappeared on the same day as Jacqueline. Then, on January 18th, 21-year-old Patricia Laney was waiting for a bus in the same area when she disappeared too. Patricia was found the next day, shot to death, and dumped in Refugio Canyon. 2 days later, Jacqueline was found in the same remote area. Both victims had been killed by a shot to the head from a small caliber gun, a .22 caliber revolver. Mary Saris was not found until May 22nd in Drum Canyon, north of Santa Barbara. She had suffered the same fate, a single shot to the head. 275-pound high school dropout Thor Christensen was interviewed by police, along with hundreds of other people, after he was arrested for being a minor in possession of alcohol. But he wasn't considered a suspect even though the police found a .22 caliber pistol in his car. Then, on April 18, 1979, 24-year-old Linda Preston was hitchhiking in Hollywood when she got into a car driven by Thor Christensen. After driving for several blocks, he shot a bullet into her left ear. But Linda managed to jump out of the car and run away. And then this part is unbelievable. On July 11th that year, Linda actually saw Christensen in a Hollywood bar and called the police, naming him as the man who had shot her 3 months earlier. They arrested him on charges of felonious assault. And this is when police put together that Christensen was responsible for all 4 victims who looked eerily similar. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in Santa Barbara on July 12, 1979. He later admitted to sexually assaulting his victims after they were dead. Later, police also charged Christensen with the murder of Laura Sue Benjamin, age 22, who disappeared on May 26, 1979. Her body was found in a culvert in the San Gabriel Mountains north of Los Angeles. She had been shot twice in the head. He was found guilty of Laura's murder after a Los Angeles trial. Christensen ended up pleading guilty to the 3 Santa Barbara County murders and was sentenced to life in prison. He was stabbed to death in the chest while in the exercise yard at Folsom State Prison on March 30, 1981, by an unidentified perpetrator. So you can hear why Christensen was of interest. He left his victims in remote areas after shooting them in the heads with a .22 and raping them post-mortem. But there was more. The investigation uncovered that Christensen and his traveling partner, Victor Tarvin, were roaming Oregon in mid-1977. They lived in Salem for the months of June and July, when Tarvin went back to California. But before settling there, they traveled throughout the Willamette Valley. Christensen remained in Salem working as a cemetery vault manufacturer until September 1977, before he, too, returned to California. Investigators' notes say, quote, interviews of Christensen and Tarvin, as well as professionals who spoke with them, gave reason to believe that one or both of them were involved in killings while in Oregon, end quote. Detective West was all in on Christensen. He tracked down and interviewed everyone who had visited him in prison. He tried to replicate the serial killer's movements during his time in Oregon. He tried to figure out what vehicles Christensen had access to and any guns he'd used. This was all he could do because they weren't able to get DNA for Christensen. The medical examiner had not retained any DNA or biological samples when Christensen was killed in prison in 1981, and the shank that he'd been stabbed with was lost. Christensen stayed firmly on the list of suspects. Detective West continued to try to push Lliana and Eric's case forward, despite the ever-increasing odds against solving the crime that was further and further in the rearview mirror. West and now Sergeant Chad Rogers continued to work their way through the case file, trying to dig up anything they thought could even remotely be a lead. You take it personally. I mean, it's a couple of high school kids, just having a picnic and fishing, and just totally out of the blue, West told reporter Matt Templeman of KEZI, explaining why he continued to volunteer his time to work the case. Detective West also paid attention to rapidly improving DNA technology, and come 2018, the advent of forensic genealogy. After all, the one good lead they had in this case was the genetic profile of their suspect. They still had his semen on the towels found at the crime scene. In 2018, Detective West submitted the DNA evidence from the towels for preparation of a SNP profile using the autosomal DNA of the suspect. The profile was then provided to Parabon Nanolabs for analysis. Parabon's initial report, dated November 1, 2018, was disappointing. There were only very low-level DNA relatives in the open-source databases, and genealogy analysis was not recommended at that time. But Parabon did use its phenotyping technology to create a snapshot image of the man who had killed Lliana and Eric. Parabon's 2019 snapshot phenotype predicted that the suspect most likely had blue or green eyes. The suspect likely had blonde hair. He also had fair or very fair skin and very few freckles. And his genetic makeup showed that his ancestors were likely very recent immigrants from Northern Europe, which included Denmark. Remember Thor Christensen? Detective West and Sergeant Rogers sure did. Once the cold case investigators received this phenotype on the suspect showing likely Danish ancestry and white blonde hair, they revisited Christensen. Remember, he was a serial killer who shot his victims with a .22 and who had been in Oregon, less than 50 miles away, during the time of the murders. He certainly had Danish ancestry, just look at his name. He looked a heck of a lot like the snapshot. But Christensen had been stabbed in prison before the DNA era and had been cremated. Attempts to obtain consensual DNA samples from Christensen's siblings were all denied. Things were at a standstill until Christensen's brother cooperated by dying. Detective West was able to work with a detective and the medical examiner in California to get a DNA sample from the brother. The sample was submitted for kinship testing against the DNA and evidence, and it wasn't a match. They were sure it was going to be him, but it wasn't. Detective West and Sergeant Rogers were astounded when Christensen was ruled out. How could it not have been him? It all fit, except the DNA. They were so convinced that they had the right guy, they questioned the lab as to the accuracy of their results. Deflated, they decided to look into Victor Tarvin. Tarvin and Christensen had gone to high school together and were known associates in the late 70s, including in Oregon. Maybe the two, traveling through the state together, had worked in tandem to kill Lliana and Eric, and Tarvin was the one whose semen was on the towel. Detective West worked with a Detective Cole, who was investigating an unsolved homicide in San Luis Obispo that he suspected Thor Christensen of committing. Detective Cole agreed to try to obtain a DNA sample from Victor Tarvin. They agreed that Detective Cole would ask Tarvin to come in for an interview on the pretense that Detective Cole was investigating Thor Christensen and that he would not mention the Oregon murders. The hope was that Cole could grab a surreptitious DNA sample from Tarvin during or after the interview. Well, it didn't work out that way. Tarvin said he did not feel comfortable meeting at the sheriff's office, so they decided to meet at a local Starbucks where everyone feels comfortable. They agreed to meet on July 11, 2019. Detective Cole arrived early and watched as Tarvin pulled into the parking lot. He noted that Tarvin acted very suspicious, scanning the parking lot and pacing around and never going inside the Starbucks, instead walking around the building twice. Cole finally got out of his car and made contact with Tarvin. Quote, "I offered to buy Tarvin a cup of coffee and he said he does not drink coffee due to his anxiety issues." Why are you meeting at a Starbucks then? Anyway, super suspiciously, Tarvin brought with him an orange juice bottle which appeared to have water in it, and he drank from that bottle and that bottle only. The two started talking about Tarvin's travels with Thor Christensen. He acknowledged that in 1977 he and Christensen traveled Oregon together. Tarvin only stayed for 2 months, but Christensen stayed on longer. Detective Cole asked Tarvin if Christensen ever had a gun, and after hemming and hawing for a bit, Tarvin said Christensen did have a gun while they were in Oregon. He said, quote, "It was probably a .22 because that's what he used." Tarvin said Christensen tended to drink a lot because his father beat the shit out of him when he was a kid. He also said that Christensen liked to go off on his own, drinking and driving around alone. He admitted that while they were in Oregon, he lost track of Christensen for periods of time. When the detective asked about where in Oregon they went, Tarvin mentioned Roseburg, Salem, and Portland. The detective noted that Interstate 5 runs directly through Eugene, Oregon, between Roseburg and Salem. When they concluded the interview, Tarvin put the orange juice bottle in his back pocket and walked away. Detective Cole was unable to get a covert DNA sample. Sounds like Tarvin knew exactly what he was looking for. The report from the Lane County investigators states simply, "We have been unable to surreptitiously connect DNA from Victor Tarvin."
Missions to Mars, driverless cars, AI chatbots. Feels like we're already living in the future. Well, Robinhood is built for the future of trading. Robinhood's intuitive design makes trading seamless. Spot opportunities and take control of your trades with tools like screeners, simulated returns, and Strategy Builder. On Robinhood, traders have access to hundreds of popular stocks and ETFs, 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, so you can keep up with today's fast-paced markets. You can now even trade stocks and crypto all in one place with the new desktop platform, Robinhood Legend. The future of trading is fast, powerful, and precise. Experience it now on Robinhood. Investing is risky. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. Trading during extended hours involves additional risks. Cryptocurrency services are offered through an account with Robinhood Crypto LLC, NMLS ID 1702840. Robinhood Crypto is licensed to engage in virtual currency business activity by the New York State Department of Financial Services.
In 2020, the Lane County investigators asked Parabon to try genealogy again. 2 years had passed. Perhaps there were better matches in the database by this point. Parabon's report, dated July 6, 2020, reflects that the suspect's raw data file was uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA as private law enforcement kits. A match list was generated from individuals participating in both databases. There were 2 standout matches in Family Tree DNA who shared DNA with the suspect. The top match shared 229 centimorgans, and the second shared 146 centimorgans. These 2 were a parent and child, and were in genetic network number 1. The third top match, located in GEDmatch, was 85 centimorgans. A fourth match of 63 centimorgans was also found in both databases and also was a part of genetic network number 1. A footnote mentions matches 5, 6, and 7, which ranged from 50 centimorgans at the high end to 14 centimorgans on the lower end. Matches 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 all shared DNA with each other and were related to the suspect on the same branch of his family tree, thus creating genetic network number 1. Matches 3 and 7 did not share any DNA with any of the other matches, so they were likely related to the suspect on a different branch of his family tree. Genetic network number 1 was all descended from the marriage between John Durham Vendeventer and Mary Boyer, both born in the 1790s. Because the genealogist knew that match number 1 and the suspect shared 229 centimorgans of DNA, which was consistent with a second cousin or a second cousin once removed, she identified the great-grandparents of match number 1, knowing that these were likely also the great-grandparents of the suspect. People have 8 sets of great-grandparents, so this makes the family tree building somewhat manageable. The common great-grandparents were Catherine Vandeventer and Jacob Browning. So once the genealogist mapped out the descendants of Catherine and Jacob, then it was time to see if she could triangulate with genetic network number 2. This was done when the genealogist, building out all the branches of genetic network number 1, noted that Lloyd Morgan Browning, the son of Catherine and Jacob, had married the first cousin twice removed of match number 7. This was Evelyn May Strait. The 2 married in Oregon in 1926. This marriage connected the genetic networks, and the genealogist knew that the suspect must descend from this union between Lloyd and Evelyn. The report says, quote, "Based on the amount of shared DNA with the top match, the subject is most likely the grandson of Lloyd and Evelyn Browning," end quote. Lloyd and Evelyn had only one son in their short marriage, and then the records from the 1930 census show that Evelyn and her and Lloyd's son Albert Bentley Browning had moved in with her parents. In October 1930, Evelyn remarried to Orville Hugh Shroy and took his last name. They had one son together, and Orville adopted Evelyn's son Albert Browning, who became Albert Shroy. Albert Shroy married Betty Jane Loudenbeck on June 3, 1950, in Newport, Oregon. They had 4 kids, 3 sons, one of whom I'm calling Keith, one of whom I'm calling David, and Ronald, as well as a daughter whose first initial is L. Keith, David, and Ronald were second cousins to match number 1 and second cousins once removed to match number 2. Parabon's July 6, 2020 report hypothesized that one of these 3 brothers was the suspect the Lane County authorities were looking for. Not only was their family tree placement consistent with the familial relationships indicated by the shared centimorgans, but the family lived in Oak Ridge, Oregon, near Fall Creek in 1977. And the patriarch, Father Albert Shroy, served in the Navy during World War II and then worked for the U.S. Forest Service in Oregon as a fire control officer. He retired in 1978, the year after the murders occurred in the very place he worked to protect. Parabon's report also noted, quote, based on the 1973 to 1974 Oak Ridge High School yearbook photos of the three Schroy brothers, Ronald's traits appear to be most consistent with the phenotype predictions, end quote. The older two brothers had darker hair than Ronald. Finally, after decades of futility, the investigators had a scientific lead. None of the Schroy brothers' names were anywhere in the massive case file, and the investigators confirmed that none of the brothers' DNA was in CODIS. But the DNA evidence and the circumstantial evidence of their geographic location and their families tied to the National Forest were convincing. It was time to collect some DNA. They didn't want to approach the suspects. That would tip off the killer and he could escape. Trash pulls, where the investigators grab a bag of household trash outside the suspect's house, are illegal in Oregon. They were going to have to get DNA another way. Although Ronald Schroy, the oldest brother, seemed to most resemble the phenotype predictions, only Keith still lived in Oregon. So the investigators started by snagging his DNA to run against the suspect DNA. Detective Greg Jones organized surveillance operations on Keith, who worked from home, but frequently was observed leaving the house on deliveries. When he went out on these deliveries, they followed him in unmarked vehicles. For several days, they kept at it, watching Keith smoke in his vehicle as he drove, and then not throwing the butt out the window. Finally, at a red light, Detective Jones watched from a few cars back as Keith's hand dangled out the window, smoldering ciggy butt between his fingers. As the light turned green, he dropped it. Jones drove up, pulling his gloves on, and stopped, opened his door, and scooped it up. The butt was still smoking. But it wasn't a smoking gun. The police report says, quote, after obtaining a discarded cigarette butt from the only Schroy brother living in Lane County, that brother's DNA was sent to the OSP crime lab for analysis and determined he was not a match to our suspect. But all was not lost. The Y DNA in the profile on the cigarette butt matched the Y DNA of the suspect. Whoever he was related to Keith along the same paternal line, a brother. They were going to have to focus the investigation on the other two brothers who lived together in Mesa, Arizona. Sergeant Rogers contacted Detective Delia Marquez of the Mesa Police Department on July 28, 2020, and brought her up to speed with what was going on. One of two brothers who lived together in her jurisdiction was likely a suspected murderer wanted in his state. The brothers' names were David and Ronald Schroy. Detective Marquez verified that Ronald and David did live together at the address she had for them in Mesa, and she and her team started working to try to gather cast-off DNA from either one of them to try to figure out which one of the brothers was the perpetrator of the 1977 double murder. A Mesa Police Department surveillance team tried to stake out the brothers, but there was no way to do so in the trailer park they lived in, which was laid out in a neat grid pattern of tightly packed modular homes. Their trash went into a community dumpster. The brothers didn't leave the house much. Mesa police surveillance teams were frustrated in their efforts to obtain DNA, and of course, they had active cases that were considered higher priority, so all of this ate up a lot of time. The Oregon detectives finally decided that they had no choice but to pull together search warrants for the trailer home. They didn't think a judge would sign off on a warrant for DNA collection when they didn't know which brother they wanted it from. But at least if they searched the trailer, things would get moving and maybe someone would give consensual DNA or confess. But that's not the way it went down. On February 24, 2021, at 3:51 p.m., Mesa police officer Y. Al-Araji responded to a domestic disturbance at 4860 East Main Street, number R1. At 3:43 p.m., a male 911 caller who identified himself as David Schroy had stated that his brother had beaten him in the face and he wanted to report his brother for assault. His brother's name was Ronald Schroy. When Officer Al-Araji arrived at the trailer home, David identified himself as the 911 caller. He had blood on his nose, chin, and hands. His black shirt had red blood on it. He had a large purple and pink contusion under his right eye, a pink discoloration on the left side of his head, and blood and a cut on his left ear. The living room area of the trailer bore substantial evidence that a fight had occurred. There was a red substance staining the carpet near one of the reclining chairs and another red stain on the carpet near the TV stand. There was an overturned and broken lamp. A hat lay on the ground, and a paper towel with red stains on it was in one of the trash cans. There were red stains on the ground near the trash can and on the kitchen counter near the sink and in the kitchen sink. There was even a red stain on the drying rack. David said his brother Ronald was in the carport. I have to explain here that the carport, which was a covered parking area attached to the side of the trailer home, had been partially converted into a sleeping area. The trailer Ronald and David shared had only one bedroom, so Ronald installed a bed out there. Officer Al-Araji found Ronald lying on his back on the bed, his feet on the floor at the end of the bed. There was an M1 rifle lying across his feet with one spent casing and one bullet next to it. The barrel of the rifle, which had blood spatter on it, was facing south and Ronald's head was facing east. A large circular bloody wound was visible under his chin. He lay on a comforter that was stained with blood above his head and underneath his body. A quote from CSI Leslie Kelly's report: "Several apparent biological matter stains were observed on the ceiling. Several holes were observed on the ceiling tiles over the bed. When the ceiling tile was removed, an additional hole was observed in the metal paneling of the roof." End quote. Inspection of Ronald's body revealed he had broken skin on his right thumb and the knuckle area on the back of his right hand. He had a circular exit wound on the back of his head near his neck. Paramedics were called but could not find a pulse, and Ronald was pronounced deceased at 4 p.m. It appeared to Officer Al-Araji that the gunshot wound to Ronald's chin was self-inflicted, but a homicide investigation was initiated to look into the situation. Detective Delia Marquez was on duty that day and received a request to respond to a domestic disturbance call where someone had been shot. At first, she didn't realize it was the same house she and her team had been trying to watch, the Shroy residence. She and 2 other detectives arrived at the scene and were briefed by officers that one neighbor had heard a gunshot followed soon thereafter by the sirens. Several neighbors had heard the brothers arguing frequently and said police had been at the home in the past. Detective Marquez interviewed David at the scene. She noted that he was disabled and walked with a cane. She observed that the living room of the trailer looked like a fight had happened there. David told the detective that he and his brother Ronald had been arguing over money. They had a list of bills that they were going over, and they disagreed about how much each was contributing. Ronald got pissed and punched David in the face several times. David picked up his phone to call 911, and Ronald walked away and went into the carport area. David told the 911 dispatcher that his brother had assaulted him and he was afraid for his safety. Then he waited for the police to come. He said he hadn't heard the gunshot from his brother's room. Detective Marquez listened to the 911 call audio and confirmed that the gunshot was not audible. David was disabled and said his brother Ronald was the aggressor. David had injuries to his face and Ronald had bruised knuckles. The position of Ronald's body and the gun and the trajectory of the bullet through the ceiling were all consistent with suicide. A gunshot residue test performed on Ronald would later confirm that he had fired the gun. So now, Detective Marquez noted that one of the 2 suspects in the Oregon double homicide investigation was dead. The other one was there with her. She asked if he would be willing to give a DNA sample, and he agreed, even though he didn't know what it was for. She had CSI Leslie Kelly take a sample from David, and she arranged for a search warrant to obtain a blood blot from the body of Ronald Shroy, which was collected by senior crime specialist Christine Hagan and sent to the Lane County Crime Lab. So after the whole mess at the Shroy house was wrapped up, Detective Marquez called Sergeant Rogers on February 25th and told him that one of the suspects had killed himself after a dispute between the 2 brothers. I probably don't need to tell you that when the Lane County Sheriff's Office tested the blood blot against the 1977 evidence, they determined that Ronald Shroy was the donor of the DNA collected in 1977. He was the man who killed Eric and Lliana all those decades ago. He had no idea that the police were hot on his trail. Rather than face being arrested by police on a domestic called in by his brother, he took his own life. He sensed that his time was up. Detective Kurt West said, "Part of his committing suicide is he's thinking this is coming."
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, the number 2, protect.gov.
So after Ronald Shroy died, literally as the investigators were closing in on him, they had to turn to his family and those who knew him best to try to obtain information on their suspect. Various teams of detectives were sent to talk to Ronald's younger brother Keith and his sister, Elle. In brief, Keith was defiant and refused to believe that his oldest brother could have done anything like what was being alleged by the investigators. The sister, Elle, said she doubted Ronald was responsible, but she didn't sound quite as certain as Keith. And then there was David. He told a whole different story about his oldest brother, Ronald. Detective West and Detective Sergeant Chad Rogers of the LCSO decided to go speak with David Shroy in person. He was arguably the person who knew Ronald best. They flew down to Mesa, Arizona on August 18, 2021. Detective Marquez made the introduction because she had established a rapport with David after his brother's suicide. They decided not to tell David the real reason for the visit until they were already there. They would tell him it was part of his brother's death investigation. They drove up to the trailer home and David was sitting on a chair outside. He agreed to answer some questions about his brother. David said that he and his siblings had grown up in Oregon, but their parents had moved to Arizona in the 1980s. Ronald was older than David and had left the family home right out of high school to join the Army in approximately 1973. Ronald was in the Army for 3 to 4 years, getting out in 76 or 77. He had completed his basic training in Texas and returned to the Eugene area where he was married twice. Then he had been stationed in Colorado Springs working in Army hospitals. His third wife was in Colorado as well. After Colorado, Ronald had moved to Dallas, Texas, where he worked in trucking and construction prior to moving to Mesa, Arizona sometime in 2008 or 2009. There, he moved into the same trailer park as his parents, but in a separate trailer. David believed that Ronald's living costs were subsidized by their mother, whom Ronald was very close with. He said Ronald refused to work and preferred his mother to pay for him. After their father died, Ronald moved into their mother's trailer to take care of her. When she died in 2017, David moved in with Ronald as neither of them could afford to live on their own. Money was a constant bone of contention between the brothers. They had agreed to split living expenses. Quote, "Throughout our conversation, David described his oldest brother Ronald as a bully. He stated they constantly argued over money," end quote. David said Ronald had done things like sell David's truck without him knowing and using the proceeds to pay living expenses for both of them. David did not have fond memories of his childhood with his older brother Ronald. He said Ronald beat up a lot of kids in high school. He didn't take any crap off nobody, he said. But David said as children, Ronald was always aggressive and hostile toward him as well. He regularly assaulted his youngest brother. Quote, "He tormented the crap out of me. He always beat me. I was so terrified of Ron, it wasn't funny. When I was in junior high, I started having some real emotional problems over it. I was having anxiety attacks, and I didn't want to get on the school bus and go home because I knew Ron would be there. I was terrified of him." Remember that the day Ronald took his own life, he and David had had a physical fight that involved Ronald punching the disabled David in the face. David said that during the last 4 years that they had lived together, during which they basically sat around and watched TV, Ronald had beaten him many, many times. Quote, "Throughout our conversation, David consistently referred to his brother as being generally a mean person who frequently got into physical fights. David also described his brother as kind of a secretive type," end quote. According to David, Ronald was very private and did not trust people. He believed that someone was out to get him. All right, everyone listening to this podcast will love this part. David told the investigators that he and Ronald drank beer and watched a lot of true crime documentaries together. Yes, he said he and his brother had watched TV shows about law enforcement's use of kinship DNA to catch bad guys, but Ronald had never commented about these. Quote, "David then volunteered he saw a DNA ancestry commercial, and he told Ronald he was thinking about submitting his DNA to learn more about their family lineage. David stated Ron, quote, just went ballistic. He further stated Ronald just about hopped out of his seat and blew his top. David stated Ronald's reasoning was that the database could be violated. Ronald said, you don't know where your DNA is going to end up." David guessed that this conversation about the DNA had been about 3 years earlier. He said after that, he didn't submit his DNA. But now, police were pretty certain that Ronald hadn't taken his own life over a domestic violence altercation and possible weekend in jail. Instead, he knew that a conviction for assault on his brother would mean DNA collection under Arizona law, and that would lead to the police finding out his dirty, decades-old secret. David said something else enlightening about Ronald. The detectives asked David about the incident in which the police had been called to the trailer in 2018. Here is a description of that incident. Police had responded to the Tower Point mobile home park on a domestic violence assault call in which David was the victim. The Mesa police arrest report documents David stated he was drinking and decided to confront his older brother Ronald about historical sexual abuse he suffered as a child at the hands of Ronald. This led to Ronald punching David in the face with a closed fist. David called the police, and Ronald admitted that he had punched his brother and he was arrested for misdemeanor assault. Now, in 2021, the investigators asked about this, whether Ronald had indeed sexually abused David as a child. David didn't want to talk about it, but became visibly emotional, even tearing up. He said, quote, "Ron was a very abusive person. He enjoyed it. He had some sexual appetites that were really out of line. He used to brag about when he lived in Dallas, how he belonged to some kind of club that they had rented a warehouse and they were doing sadomasochism type stuff." The investigators now told David that they were investigating a cold case and had received some information that maybe Ronald was associated with a violent crime. David said he wouldn't be surprised because Ronald was such a violent person and that he was a very good shot with a handgun. A quote from the file: David recalled Ronald owned a single-action .22 caliber revolver. He was not certain of the brand, but thought it may have been a Ruger brand. Among the handguns listed as firing the .22 caliber bullets that killed both Adank and Goldstrand was a manufacturer known as Rome. Rome made a copy of the Ruger single-6 revolver. David knew Ronald had this revolver through the mid-1970s, but did not know what he did with it after David joined the Navy, end quote. Well, there you have it. Ronald had owned a gun consistent with the one used to kill Lliana and Eric. David also told the investigators that Ronald had bragged about being involved in some kind of drug deal shootout. This turned out not to be true, but shows the kind of person Ronald was, that he thought that was a cool thing to boast about. David said he also had reason to believe that Ronald had been selling Army hospital medication illegally. And David made another connection for the investigators. He said that in the 1970s, Ronald owned a 650cc gold and white Triumph motorcycle that he loved. This is consistent with one of the vehicles seen at Broken Bowl Campground at the time of the murders, and the motorcycle oil found in the parking lot near the scene. Toward the end of the interview, Detective West asked David whether he would be surprised if Ronald was involved in being sexually abusive or violent toward a woman, and he said he wouldn't be surprised at all. Then they finally told David that they had Ronald's DNA on some old evidence from 1977 and that he had killed 2 kids up at Broken Bowl. David looked down and shook his head. He said, I'm sorry. I feel embarrassed for my family."
Trading shouldn't have barriers. When Robinhood started, it was built to make trading more accessible. Now Robinhood offers more sophisticated trading tools. Experience the future of trading on Robinhood Legend, the all-new desktop platform that harnesses intuitive design to deliver a seamless experience for traders. Free to use with a Robinhood account, Robinhood Legend is designed for how you trade, with powerful charts including custom intervals down to the tick, and over 80 indicators and drawing tools. Trade all your favorite assets, including popular stocks and ETFs, all in one place. Take your trading to the next level by customizing your layout in seconds, and even enter and exit positions in one tap, right from the chart, with up to 8 charts per layout. The future of trading is fast, powerful, and precise. Experience it now on Robinhood Legend. Sign up today. Investing is risky. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. Other fees may apply.
Next, the investigators tracked down all 3 of Ronald's ex-wives. San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Detective Steve Archibald contacted Ronald's first ex-wife, Catherine. She had married Ronald on November 3, 1973, and they divorced on January 12, 1978. They were married when Ronald killed Lliana and Eric. Catherine said they met when they were both in the Army in San Antonio, Texas, and they married after knowing each other only 6 weeks. She was 19 and, quote, young and dumb, she said. But she said that when they first met, she thought Ronald was a great guy. He was well-liked, had lots of friends, and had no problems that she knew of. She never knew him as a violent individual or someone capable of sexual violence. Catherine said that after she and Ronald did their combat medic school training in the Army, they were assigned to Fort Carson, Colorado. After that, they moved to Eugene, Oregon in 1976. They lived with Ronald's parents for 6 months. Ronald was very close with his mother, she said. Then they went to nursing school in Tacoma, Washington. Catherine said in 1977 she and Ronald were living in an apartment in downtown Eugene. This was about 30 miles from the Fall Creek Recreation area. She was working as a nurse at Valley West Healthcare Center, and he worked for an ambulance company. But then he began working as a nurse on the graveyard shift at Springfield Hospital. They worked opposite schedules and really didn't see each other. Catherine said Ronald would go out during the day and would often return home just in time to leave for his graveyard shift at the hospital. She had no idea where he went on those daytime excursions, or about his whereabouts or activities during the afternoons and evenings while she was at work. She later discovered he was having an affair with the head charge nurse at the ER where he worked. Ronald came home one day after they'd been married 4 years and asked for a divorce. The two had grown apart and no longer had anything in common, so she readily agreed. They split in the fall of 1977, and they had no children. Detective Archibald summed up the interview with the following quote: "Schroy was a big guy, well thought of, intelligent, and known for his kindness. Catherine never had any knowledge, concerns, or suspicions that he may have been involved in anything violent. She never noticed any significant behavioral changes. He was just a regular, normal guy. The only thing he hid from her was that he was dating his head nurse." End quote. Catherine didn't remember the Broken Bowl murders in 1977, and she had no idea if Ronald had burned or threw away any clothing that June. She said that as a teenager, Ronald told her he liked to hunt, rock climb, fish, and spend time in the woods. But as far as she knew, he didn't have any guns, and she never remembered him shooting anything. She also didn't remember him really having any friends. As for vehicles while living in Eugene, Ronald had access to 3, a white Volkswagen camper van, a brown, very small Honda, and a brown Datsun 210 that replaced the Honda. He did not have a motorcycle, as Catherine recalled. This was contrary to what David had reported about the green and gold Triumph his brother adored. On August 23, 2021, Detective Sergeant Chad Rogers called Margaret M. on the phone. She was another ex-wife of Ronald's, his second. She said she met him around 1978 when they both attended Lane Community College flight technology courses. Ronald was living with the nurse he had left his first wife for, but he left that nurse for Margaret. Margaret and Ronald married about 2 years later, and they moved to Phoenix, Arizona for about 3 years, where Ronald worked as a pilot and flight instructor. They moved back to the Eugene area in 1984, where he worked at the airport and then went to work for Guarantee Chevrolet. Like Catherine, Margaret did not recall Ronald having any guns in their home. She said he didn't talk much about his past, but did mention that he had some involvement in dealing illicit drugs when he was in the military. This is a quote from Detective Sergeant Rogers' report. Margaret said that Ronald was generally a likable, friendly, easygoing individual. They argued on occasion, but he never physically abused her. She also described Ronald as kind of a weird guy. It seemed as though he was hiding something from her, but it didn't really become obvious until the end of their marriage, when he told her about how he had been involved in incidents of group sex and sadomasochistic sexual activities with other people. They divorced in 1990 and did not stay in touch, end quote. The couple did not have children. Detective Sergeant Rogers next contacted Cheryl B., Ronald's third wife. She met and married Ronald in Mesa, Arizona in the mid-1990s. They were both working at Earhart Ford. After they married, they moved to Colorado Springs and then Pueblo, Colorado. They divorced in 2002, and they had no contact since then. Like the other wives, Cheryl also said that she never saw any indication that Ronald was prone to violence. They divorced simply because they grew apart and had little in common. She did suspect that he was probably having affairs while she was working out of town. She said the only gun that she knew of Ronald owning was a Desert Eagle .50 caliber pistol. He didn't discuss his past much, and he didn't seem to have very many friends, but he was close with his mother. Cheryl and Ronald had no children. The investigators tried very hard to find the woman mentioned by Ronald's first and second wives, the head ER nurse he had an affair and moved in with. According to his first wife, Catherine, she found out in 1977 that Ronald was cheating on her with this nurse, so it seems likely that Ronald and the nurse were an item at the time Lliana and Eric were killed. And the investigators were particularly interested in talking to her because they had reason to suspect she might have information about the murders. The day after they happened, a local attorney in Eugene had called the police with a tip. He said that an unidentified woman had left a message with his answering service during the overnight hours when his office was closed. The message was something along the lines of, "I think there's been a murder." Now, I have to admit, when I initially saw this tip in the case file, I scrolled past it, chalking it up to a kook. But the investigators aren't so sure. They suspect it might have been Ronald's side piece who had found out somehow what he had done that evening and was calling an attorney for help. Unfortunately, as I said, they've never been able to locate this woman, so we'll never know. Another thing we'll never know is how exactly Eric's library card ended up in 3 pieces in a completely different area where it was found after the murders. Eric's wallet was in the truck with cash still in it. How did his library card end up in bits on a remote roadway? Was this totally unrelated from an excursion to the area on another day? And finally, I asked Sergeant Rogers if he believed that the masturbating creep in the maroon Camaro seen by two women at Fall Creek was Ronald. He said they were never able to link Ronald to a vehicle of that description, but that behavior seems consistent with what we know about Ronald, his excessive sex drive, and his victimization of women. And of course, we know he was hanging out at Fall Creek at the time. After gathering all this information about Ronald Schroy, the Lane County investigators were finally able to reveal to Eric and Lliana's families that they had an answer to their decades-old question of who killed their loved ones. Both Adank parents had passed, but some members of Lliana's extended family were still around. According to the cold case investigators and Sergeant Rogers, the families were relieved just to know. None of them had ever heard of Ronald Schroy, and they didn't recognize his photo. This is from KEZI.com, quote, Lliana's cousin Kathy Kloster said she'd never entirely lost hope, and neither had Donna Burback, Eric's mother. I didn't think it was an impossibility, but I thought it was far-reaching, Burback said. Even though they know who the killer was, West said the only people who knew exactly what happened and why are dead. Kloster said it's painful, but she can live with that. It's a relief he's not going to be able to hurt anyone again, but there's a part of us who wanted to see him and know why, and all those things we're never going to know, Kloster said. It feels good that I don't have to go to a trial. I would have been terrified that he would have gotten off, Burback said. Burback and Kloster said they're forever grateful for these dedicated detectives, West, Tilby, and Engdahl, who didn't give up. They said other families in their position should remain hopeful too. But they have another message to another group. DNA and genealogy are game changers. And it should say to these criminals, just because you've made it this far, don't look over your shoulder, because one day they'll be knocking on your door, Kloster said. Hear, hear, sister. The families were so grateful that they pooled their resources to get a plaque made commemorating the cold case investigators' efforts on their behalf, and collected a donation to the Cold Case Fund. Shockingly, despite the Herculean efforts of the modern investigators, they have come up almost empty on significant additional crimes committed by Ronald Schroy. At one point when he was in Colorado with one of his wives, he was formally accused by his wife's co-worker of verbal intimidation. The police report said essentially he tried to bully or scare her into agreeing to a threesome with him and his wife. Nothing came of this. Ronald also had one DUI to his name, and that is it. There was nothing in any of the other several states he lived in besides the 2018 arrest for assault on his brother David. Detective Sergeant Rogers and I agreed that it's a near certainty that Ronald Schroy has other crimes to his name. Remember that his brother and wife said he was involved in sadomasochistic behaviors in Texas, and the woman in Colorado was scared enough of him to file a police report. Surely there are other instances in which Ronald crossed the line. It's remarkable that none of his 3 wives reported any sexual or physical abuse they suffered at Ronald's hands. It's possible that he is yet another of those killers we've seen who are able to compartmentalize and whose loved ones never get a glimpse of the dark urges that they take out on strangers. Okay, so what actually happened that June evening in 1977 at Broken Bowl Campground? Sometime between 5 and 5:30, Eric and Lliana parked Eric's truck in the parking lot and took off their outer clothing, wearing just their bathing suits and their shoes. They carried the fishing poles, tackle box, 2 towels, and the picnic Donna had packed for them down a trail toward the river. They'd set themselves up at one of the lone picnic tables in a small clearing. It would not have been visible to anyone else, as far as they knew. They went to the river. Remember, a witness saw them with the fishing poles and tackle box holding hands before 6 p.m. Then, back at the picnic area, they sat and ate, and then packed up the remaining food. Based on Eric's location in the brush along the little trail leading from the picnic area to the river, the investigators know that Eric was on that trail when he was shot by Ronald Schroy. The first shot was to his chest as he faced the picnic table. The second shot grazed the top back of his head from some distance away. Eric fell there in the brush and died. What we don't know is how the confrontation started. Remember, there were no signs of a struggle in the picnic area. The ground wasn't disturbed. Eric and Lliana's shoes were next to each other. The tackle box and fishing poles were laid neatly on the ground. My personal theory is that 23-year-old Ronald Schroy was prowling the woods that evening and was watching the couple. He was known to have a voracious and deviant sexual appetite, and the area was known to be frequented by skinny dippers. Ronald watched, and when the moment arose, he confronted the teens, gun drawn. He shot Eric, who then tried to run down the trail but was felled by the second bullet. Then Ronald ordered Lliana to take off her bikini, assaulted her, and shot her. He cleaned up using the kids' towels and disappeared into the night. The other possibility is that somehow Ronald came upon Lliana alone at the picnic area, maybe as Eric was finishing up fishing. And when Eric walked back to meet her, he interrupted the assault and provoked Ronald to shoot them both. Or Eric was at the river and he heard Lliana screaming or the gunshots and ran to the picnic area to meet his fate. However it happened, the investigators are convinced that the crime was random and Lliana and Eric were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Interestingly, in connection with the announcement of the closure of the Goldstrand and Adank case, the Lane County Sheriff's Office publicized a bulletin featuring photos of Thor Christensen and Victor Tarvin. It says, quote, 2 individuals cleared of the Adank and Goldstrand killings remain as persons of interest and are believed to have committed homicides in Oregon, end quote. If you have any information on the activities of either or both Victor Tarvin and Thor Christensen in Oregon in the summer of 1977, please contact the Lane County authorities. Speaking of unfinished business, remember the unsolved 2005 murder I mentioned of Jeanette Bauman and Stephen Hogan? I was told that case is currently unsolved, emphasis on currently, and there is DNA evidence they are working with. The DNA is not consistent with Ronald Schroy. Let's hope that I'll be able to do an episode on that case in the near future. After 44 years, the case of Eric Goldstrand and Lliana Adank is closed, thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. Thank you very much to Detective Sergeant Chad Rogers and cold case investigator Kurt West for talking with me about this case. Just a heads up that there will not be a Doe episode next Monday, Memorial Day. Here in the United States, it's a holiday, and I'll be dropping my son off in New York City for his summer internship. But I hope to see many of you at CrimeCon. Please stop by the DNA ID booth and introduce yourselves. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to DNAIDpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.